Before we begin, if you value this kind of deep analysis meaningful, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It genuinely helps us continue creating research-driven content like this and bringing these stories to light. Serial killers leave behind victims, but sometimes the investigation leaves victims too. In the late 1980s, South Korea was terrorized by a series of murders that seemed impossible to solve. Women were being killed in rural fields. Evidence kept disappearing, and police were under enormous pressure to catch the killer. So they did something that investigators sometimes do when fear outweighs certainty. They started forcing confessions. Innocent suspects were coerced, abused during interrogation, and imprisoned. Decades later, forensic science finally revealed the real killer. But by then, the damage had already been done. Because this case forces us to confront a disturbing truth about criminal justice systems everywhere. When the pressure to solve a crime becomes overwhelming, truth can become the first casualty. This is the story of the Hwaseong Serial Murders. If you've been following this channel, you might remember that we previously explored the serial murders that haunted the hills of Tuscany for more than 17 years. Today, we're looking at a case that is eerily similar in scale and terror, but it unfolded on the other side of the globe. Instead of Italy, our story today takes us to South Korea. Between 1986 and 1991, a series of murders terrorized the rural city of Hwaseong in Gyeonggi Province, South Korea. 10 women were killed during this 5-year period. Their ages ranged from a 13-year-old middle school student to a 71-year-old elderly woman. The attacks appeared random. The victims were ordinary people walking home, waiting for buses, or traveling along quiet rural roads. At the time, South Korea had never encountered a serial murder case of this scale. Authorities mobilized enormous investigative resources. Thousands of officers were deployed. Tens of thousands of individuals were investigated, and extensive forensic examinations were conducted in a desperate effort to identify the killer. Yet despite these efforts, the murders continued. For decades, the Hwaseong murders remain the country's most infamous unsolved criminal case. The first known murder occurred on September 15, 1986, when a 71-year-old woman named Lee Wan-im was found strangled in a field. Initially, investigators believed the incident was isolated, but within weeks, another woman, Park Hyun-suk, was murdered only a few hundred meters away. Over the next 5 years, similar crimes appeared across rural roads, rice paddies, and farmland surrounding Hwaseong. Gradually, a pattern emerged. Women were being stalked, attacked, sexually assaulted, and strangled. Most of the crimes occurred at night in poorly lit areas. The killer appeared to move confidently through farmland and irrigation paths where witnesses were rare and physical evidence could easily disappear in rain, mud, and agricultural terrain. The killer typically targeted women who were walking alone at night. Victims were frequently restrained using their own clothing, such as stockings or other garments. Many of the victims were then killed through strangulation or asphyxiation. Several cases involved sexual assault, suggesting the attacks were driven not only by violence but also by a need for domination and control. Investigators later concluded that the perpetrator possessed detailed familiarity with the rural terrain. This knowledge allowed him to approach victims quietly and escape quickly through surrounding agricultural fields. In several cases, investigators discovered that victims had been deliberately arranged or partially undressed after death. These disturbing details suggested elements of ritualistic behavior, indicating that the crimes were not purely opportunistic, but involved psychological control over the victims. For more than 3 decades, the identity of the killer remained unknown. That changed in 2019, when DNA evidence preserved from multiple crime scenes was matched with Lee Chun-jae. Lee was already serving a life sentence for the rape and murder of his sister-in-law, a crime committed in 1994. During interrogation, he confessed to multiple murders and sexual assaults, including the Hwaseong killings. The revelation finally solved one of South Korea's most infamous criminal mysteries. But the discovery also revealed something equally disturbing: the devastating consequences of the investigation itself. In the 1980s, Hwasong was not a place people associated with violence. It was farmland. Rice paddies stretched across the countryside, and villages were small, tight-knit communities where most residents knew one another. Life moved at a quiet, predictable rhythm. The murders shattered that sense of safety. As the killings continued, fear spread across the countryside. Women began altering their routines. Parents warned their daughters not to travel alone. Workers hurried home before nightfall. With no clear answers from the police, superstition began to fill the void. One rumor spread widely throughout the region: women who wore red clothing would become targets for the killer, especially on rainy nights. There was never any evidence to support the claim. Modern investigation later confirmed that Lee Chun-jae did not select victims based on the color of their clothing. But fear rarely follows logic. For many women, avoiding red became a quiet ritual of self-protection. Rainy evenings brought particular anxiety, reinforcing the belief that certain patterns or signals might trigger the killer. The rumor became so powerful that it began shaping daily life. Women refused to wear red clothing. Some residents adjusted their travel plans during storms. At one point, police even had female officers wear red garments as decoys in an attempt to lure the attacker. These behaviors were not simply superstition. They were coping mechanisms in a community living under the pressure of an unidentified predator. Women imposed strict curfews on themselves. Many stopped walking alone through rice fields or forest paths where early victims had been attacked. In some cases, residents even erected scarecrows in farmland as symbolic talismans believed to ward off danger. The fixation on red also reflected deeper tensions of the era. During the 1980s, South Korea's authoritarian government frequently used the label red to describe suspected communist sympathizers and justify political crackdowns. Critics later suggested that authorities focused heavily on suppressing political reds. The real predator operating in rural Hwaseong went undetected for years. As months turned into years, the nature of the terror began to change. At first, people feared an unknown predator hiding somewhere in the darkness of the fields. But eventually, suspicion turned inward. Neighbors began looking at one another differently. If the killer had evaded thousands of investigations, perhaps he lived among them. Trust within the community slowly eroded. The damage of the murders was no longer confined to isolated crime scenes. It had seeped into the daily life of the town itself, altering how people moved, how they spoke, and how they looked at one another. As public fear intensified, the pressure on investigators became overwhelming. Authorities were expected to solve the murders quickly. When physical evidence failed to provide answers, many investigators shifted their focus toward extracting confessions. Suspects were often subjected to extreme interrogation methods, including physical violence, sleep deprivation, intimidation, and prolonged questioning without food or rest. One of the most tragic cases involved a young mechanic named Yoon Sung-yeo. In 1989, Yoon was arrested for the murder of a teenage girl believed to be one of the serial killer's victims. Despite having a physical disability caused by childhood polio, which made aspects of the crime physically implausible, he was interrogated for days under coercive conditions. He was deprived of sleep, denied food, and repeatedly pressured until he eventually signed a confession. That confession became the foundation of the prosecution's case. Yoon was sentenced to life imprisonment, but he maintained his innocence from the beginning. He ultimately spent 20 years in prison for a crime he did not commit before being released and later exonerated. Other suspects experienced similar treatment. Some were beaten during interrogations. Others were forced to perform repeated physical exercises for hours or subjected to threats and electric shocks. In several cases, when forensic evidence failed to link a suspect to the murders, police allegedly manipulated records or pursued unrelated charges in order to justify detention and continue interrogations. Those targeted were often individuals with limited resources or social power, people who were less able to defend themselves against accusations. The human consequences were devastating. Some suspects who were publicly identified during the investigation later took their own lives after enduring the stigma and psychological pressure of being labeled potential killers. Others never fully recovered from the trauma of interrogation. One young suspect who had been subjected to electrical torture reportedly struggled to rebuild his life and died in his 20s. For the community, the damage went far beyond the investigation itself. Residents were forced to believe that someone they knew, a neighbor, a co-worker, a young man from their own village, might secretly be a murderer. Even when suspects were eventually cleared, suspicion often lingered. In the end, the investigation did not only pursue a killer, it created victims of its own. Among the least visible victims of the Hwaseong murders were the women who survived encounters with the killer. A small number managed to escape his attacks. One survivor, Lee Gumran, described a skinny man with a low voice after surviving an assault in 1986. Another woman narrowly escaped after the attacker bound her while searching for her purse. Her testimony helped investigators create the first composite sketch of the suspect, but surviving the encounter did not bring relief. In the social climate of rural South Korea during the late 1980s and early 1990s, victims of sexual violence often faced stigma rather than support. Speaking publicly about an assault could damage the reputation of an entire family, affecting marriage prospects and bring unwanted attention to a small community. As a result, many survivors remained silent, carrying the psychological burden alone. Even those indirectly connected to the crimes experienced similar stigma. Lee Chun-jae's former wife later described a marriage marked by violence and fear, recalling moments when his eyes would change and send chills down her spine. For years, she blamed herself for meeting him, saying the association had ruined her life. She only broke a silence of more than 3 decades after Lee was publicly identified as the Hwasong killer. At the time, mental health support systems for victims were extremely limited. Psychological counseling and victim advocacy services were rare, leaving many people to cope without professional help. As a result, trauma often manifested as lifelong anxiety, social withdrawal, and deep mistrust of others. For the survivors of Hwasong, the violence did not end with the attack themselves. The psychological aftermath continued to shape their lives for decades. In 2019, investigators returned to preserve DNA evidence collected from several Hwasong crime scenes. Advances in forensic technology finally produced a match identifying the suspect as Lee Chun-jae. Over 2 weeks in late 2019, the police interrogated Lee multiple times. During these sessions, he admitted responsibility for the Hwasong killings and described a broader pattern of violence. He ultimately confessed to 14 murders and to roughly 30 additional acts of sexual violence or attempted assaults. Authorities considered his confession credible because he revealed details that never been publicly released. Lee accurately described crime scene layouts, the movements of the victims, and the specific ways some victims had been restrained using their own clothing. In one instance, he even drew a near-perfect diagram of the eighth victim's home, knowledge that only the perpetrator could reasonably possess. Psychological experts later noted that Lee displayed traits commonly associated with psychopathy. Rather than showing remorse, he spoke about the crimes with unsettling pride. Some analysts believe he confessed because he was irritated that other suspects had been blamed for the murders. Others suggest that by 2019, his chances of parole were already extremely limited due to his life sentence for another murder, leaving him little reason to remain silent. For the victims' families, the revelation finally ended decades of uncertainty, but closure remained incomplete. At the time the crimes were committed, South Korean law imposed a 15-year statute of limitations for first-degree murder. Although the limit was extended to 25 years in 2007, the change applied only to cases that had not yet expired. Because the final confirmed Hwaseong murder occurred in April 1991, the legal window to prosecute the perpetrator closed in April 2006. When Lee Chun-jae was identified through DNA evidence in 2019, prosecutors could no longer legally charge him for any of the Hwasong killings he confessed to. South Korea later abolished the statute of limitations for first-degree murder through the 2015 Daewon Law. However, the law was not retroactive and applied only to crimes that were still legally prosecutable when it was enacted. By then, the Hwasong murders had already fallen outside the reach of the courts. In other words, the truth had finally surfaced, but traditional justice was no longer possible. For those who had been wrongfully accused, the revelation brought complicated emotions. Yoon Sung-yeo, who spent 20 years in prison for the 8th murder, said the confession did not immediately bring peace. Arrested at just 22 years old, he often described that moment as the point when his life effectively stopped. Even after his eventual exoneration, the stigma of being publicly branded a killer left deep psychological scars. Financial compensation and official apologies could not restore the decades of life that had been taken from him. Others never lived to see the truth emerge. Yoon Dong-il, who had been investigated as a suspect in another of the murders, died of cancer in 1997 at the age of 26 after enduring illegal detention and public suspicion. His family lived with the stigma of his supposed guilt for decades before the courts finally cleared his name years later. The confession also revealed the broader human damage caused by the investigation itself. Several individuals who had been treated as suspects later took their own lives after facing intense social stigma and psychological pressure. Another young man who endured severe interrogation tactics, including electric shocks, never fully recovered and died in his 20s. Courts eventually acknowledged that the investigation had relied on coercive interrogations, unreliable evidence, and claims that defied the basic physical realities. In Yoon Sung-yeo's case, investigators insisted that he had climbed a wall to enter a home despite his physical disability, an assertion that should have raised immediate doubts. Seen in hindsight, Lee Chun-jae's confession did more than identify the killer. It exposed how desperation within the justice system had led authorities to sacrifice the lives and reputations of innocent people. From the perspective of 2026, the Hwasong case represented more than the resolution of a cold case. It marks a turning point in how South Korea understands justice, forensic science, and the protection of suspects and victims alike. The investigative failures of the 1980s revealed deep structural weaknesses. Despite deploying more than 2 million police man-days and examining over 21,000 suspects, investigators relied heavily on confessions rather than scientific evidence. A contaminated blood sample led authorities to conclude the killer had type B blood, causing them to repeatedly exclude Lee Chun-jae, whose blood type is O, from the suspect list. That error delayed the truth for decades. The wrongful conviction of Yoon Sung-yeo further demonstrated how investigative pressure could distort justice. Despite his physical disability from childhood polio, which made key aspects of the alleged crime impossible, he was interrogated under coercive conditions until he gave a false confession. His acquittal in 2020 forced the country to confront the human costs of investigative shortcuts. In the years that followed, South Korea gradually shifted from a confession-driven policing model to one grounded in forensic science and evidence-based investigation. The 2019 identification of Lee Chun-jae was itself a product of that transformation. Advances in DNA amplification allowed scientists to recover usable genetic profiles from decades-old evidence, which could then be matched through a national DNA database established under a 2010 law requiring violent offenders to submit DNA samples. The shock of discovering the real killer decades later also fueled legal reform. Public outrage over inability to prosecute Lee contributed to the passage of the 2015 Taewon Law, abolishing the statute of limitations for first-degree murder in South Korea. Although the law could not apply retroactively to the Hwaseong killings, it ensured that future cases would not expire because justice could be pursued. Culturally, the case also prompted deep reflection. The events inspired Bong Joon-ho's film Memories of Murder in 2003, which portrayed the frustration, the investigative incompetence, and social tension surrounding the case. Over time, the film became a symbol of South Korea's willingness to confront the failures of its past. Today, the Hwaseong murders are studied not only as a series of crimes, but as a lesson in systemic failure. They led to improvements in forensic capabilities, strengthened victim advocacy, and greater scrutiny of investigative practices. From the vantage point of 2026, the case stands as a reminder that the pursuit of justice must evolve. Because discovering the truth requires not only catching the guilty, but also protecting the innocent. Hwaseong today bears little resemblance to the rural landscape of the 1980s. At the time of the murders, the region was largely agricultural. Rice paddies, wooded paths, and poorly connected bus routes meant that many residents, especially women, had to walk long distances alone after dark. That isolation created conditions in which the killer could approach victims and appear into farmland without being seen. Residents later recalled living with constant anxiety. One woman remembered becoming obsessed with getting home early, unable to shake the fear that the killer might appear at any moment. In the decades since, Hwaseong has transformed into a modern city and industrial hub. High-rise buildings, dense residential districts, and expanded transportation networks now occupy areas that were once farmland. Investigative experts often note that if the same crimes occurred today, the perpetrator would likely be identified quickly through modern forensic methods, extensive CCTV coverage, and contemporary profiling techniques. Yet while the physical landscape has changed, the memory of the murders continues to shape the region's identity. For many residents, the case remains a form of collective trauma woven into local history. When Lee Chun-jae was identified in 2019, many described a moment as bringing a long-delayed finality of truth. For some families and residents, that revelation lifted decades of suspicion and shame. Yoon Sung-yeo, who had been wrongfully imprisoned, said that the truth finally allowed him and his family to live without the stigma that followed them for years. Posthumous acquittals also helped restore the reputations of individuals who died under suspicion. When Yoon Dong-il's name was cleared, the family said they felt his memory could finally rest with dignity rather than the label of a monster. Even so, echoes of the past remain visible in cultural memory. Rumors from the era, including the belief that the killer targeted women wearing red on rainy days, have persisted as part of local folklore. The case also reshaped public attitudes toward law enforcement. The investigative failure surrounding the Hwaseong murders fostered a society that remains highly attentive to police accountability. Even decades later, new criminal investigations in the region often draw intense public scrutiny. For this reason, the Hwaseong murders remain a defining chapter in regional history. The case not only exposed the devastating consequences of the crimes themselves, but also reshaped how the community understands justice, institutional responsibility, and the importance of protecting innocent people during criminal investigations. Before we move to the final reflection, I want you to support the channel and help us continue producing careful, respectful true crime analysis. Please consider liking the video and subscribing. Your support makes it possible for us to keep putting out content like this. Thank you. For decades, the Hwaseong murders were remembered as the story of a killer who vanished into the night. But when the truth finally surfaced more than 30 years later, the case revealed something far more unsettling. Yes, a man named Lee Chun-jae had committed the crimes, but the shadow he left behind was larger than the murders themselves. Families spent decades waiting for answers that arrived too late. Innocent men lost years of their lives to accusations that should never have happened. Survivors carried their trauma in silence while the world slowly moved on. And an entire community learned what it feels like when fear quietly erodes trust between neighbors. The Hwaseong case forces us to rethink what justice actually means. Is justice simply identifying the person responsible? Or is justice the long and difficult work of restoring dignity to those who were harmed along the way? Because when the investigations become driven by pressure rather than the truth, the system that is meant to protect people can begin to wound them instead. The real legacy of Hwaseong is not only about a serial killer. It is about the cost of desperation, the fragility of justice, and the human lives caught in between. And perhaps the most important lesson is this: a crime is never finished when the killing stops. Its consequences ripple outward through families, institutions, and entire communities for generations. Only when the stories of the victims, the survivors, and the wrongfully accused are fully acknowledged can a society finally begin to heal.